Hi there, I'm Willy Wormhead, and in today's tutorial, I want to talk to you about vertical floats. Now, if you're wondering what vertical floats are, let me explain. One of my favorite topics, right, is short row color work. And when you are working short row color work, you often have to carry floats vertically if you don't want to break the yarn and weave in extra ends. So let me grab an example. This is one of my sideways knit hat designs that's due out later in the year. It's called Buddlings. And it's knit this way up. It's worn that way round. But instead of breaking the yarn bee and weaving all those extra ends in, which you don't want to do, who wants to weave in extra ends? What you do is you carry the floats. So let me just pull this around, bring that up, and you can see there's a nice line of floats along there. Now, this causes a nice line because this particular pattern, the yarn bees all stop and start in the same place. Now, that isn't always the case. If you've got this book, my book on short row colour work, there are motifs in there, especially in the stackable section, where the starting point of where yarn B starts to create the pattern moves. So this is one such swatch. This is called, the motif is called shoals. And you can see that it alternates across. And when you knit it on the back, that's what you get. Let's pull that in close there. You see the way the floats are moved across? So that's another example. And then one more. This is my Rhinebeck hat, very popular pattern. The lines on this one, with line B, go all the way to the brim edge. And so here, we can see that the floats are carried right next to the selvage, but not actually on the selvage. So I'm going to show you 3 different ways today that you can carry floats. You can carry them in a straight line away from a selvage, you can carry them next to a selvage, and you can carry them across, kind of zigzagging between your motifs. Also, that you don't have to weave in extra ends, cut your yarn, etc. It saves your yarn, it saves you having to all that extra finishing. So let me switch to the overhead and start demoing those techniques for you. Okay, so this is a swatch that I normally use in my short row colourwork workshops and demos for teaching the adjustable motifs in my book or how to balance short rows. Now for today's demo, I'm actually going to work an extra ridge of yarn A here and break the pattern slightly, because that would then mean that I would need to float yarn B up and catch it behind yarn A as I go. When it's an alternate pattern like this, you don't need to catch the floats because it's going to happen anyway because of the way that the pattern is written. However, as soon as you have 2 ridges or more of yarn A, then you're going to want to catch yarn B on the back behind it and float it upwards. So let's just forget about the fact that it's normally alternate A's and B's on here. I'm going to put an extra ridge of yarn A in here, and I'll show you how I catch yarn B as I get to this point. So we knit across. My marker is there to indicate where the border starts. So I knit this part in yarn A. I slip the marker. Now what I normally do, my preferred method, is to put my needle into the next stitch here so that it's anchored. Then bring yarn B up and hold it, and then knit the next stitch and knit across. That way it keeps them all in a nice straight line, and that's my preferred way of doing it. So let's show you that again. Come to the next stitch. You're probably familiar, hopefully, if you've watched some of my other videos, about the fact that I actually anchor my needle in the next stitch quite frequently, especially in relation to short rows. Here I'm doing it because I'm an English thrower, which means I drop everything as I'm working. And if I don't put my needle somewhere, I don't park it in a stitch, then everything's just going to get really messy and my needle's going to go walk about somewhere. So I anchor it in the next stitch. I bring yarn B up physically so that I can then knit with yarn A around it, and it gets caught behind yarn A to create that short upwards float there. The other way you could do it is if you are more familiar with, say, floats in stranded colourwork, you can do the similar technique. So put yarn B over your index finger to anchor it and hold it. Insert your needle into the next stitch as if to knit it, then gently put your needle underneath the strand of yarn B here, knit around and drop it off. What it does though is that it doesn't carry the floats up. Let's turn it all the way over. It doesn't carry the floats up in quite such a straight line. It brings it across and sits it in a different place. So you might find that you won't get a straight line like this when you do this method. You'll probably get it kind of sitting ever so slightly zigzaggy across as you bring it over, but it's still doing the same job. So I'll just demo that again for you. Okay, let's put yarn B around here, in, catch yarn B with the needle, knit around it, whoop, drop both yarn B and the stitch off, knit across, and you've created your float there. It's put yarn B one stitch over, but it doesn't matter because you can bring it back over this way when you are ready to work it again. Now let's have a look and see what that looks like inside Buddlings, the hat I showed earlier. Now let's get this around here. This is how it looks when you do it the first way that I showed you, which is my normal way of doing it. They're all in a nice straight line because yarn B starts at the same place every single point on this pattern. I normally float them one ridge apart. So that means that when I've caught it behind yarn A, which I do it on a right side row, keep the yarns at the back, always swap your yarns over on the wrong side of the work. So catch it on a right side row and then come back. So that's one ridge worked, which has got, there we go, that's a good one to look at. There's one ridge worked where the yarn has been caught. I then worked another ridge, which is 2 rows. And then on the next right side row of the next ridge, I caught it again. So I catch them alternate ridges, and that keeps it nice and even all the way along. And on the right side of the work, you can't see them at all. Let's bring that up. Because I've caught them fairly frequently, instead of leaving long floats, it's not impacted the tension. Long floats can cause your knitting to be tighter because, you know, the longer it is, you tend to pull on it as you're knitting with yarn B, and you don't want that. Catching them more frequently gives more elasticity, more stretch to your fabric, and you can't see them on the right side of the work at all. It's not there. Can't see them. Ta-da! Magic. So I'm now going to switch over and show you one of the other methods. Now, this second method I'm going to show you is when you are carrying floats where your yarn is either on the selvage or one stitch in. Because when you are carrying floats close to the selvage, there is a risk of that float kind of ending up kind of poking out underneath, and you don't want that. So this is the Rhinebeck hat. Yarn B goes all the way to the edge. The swatch I've got is one stitch in. Okay, yarn B goes to one stitch in from the selvage, but the same principle applies on how you do it. And what I've done is I carry the floats. Again, this one's actually every 2 ridges. They're caught 1 or 2 stitches inside from the selvage so that they don't poke out. So let's bring a swatch in. This has just got simple stripes on it here. And it ends 1 stitch from the selvage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, instead of carrying it where in the last example, I was carrying it where yarn B, or catching it rather, where yarn B kind of sits, so it forms a straight line. Here we're not going to do that. We're going to move it over away. So I'm going to go over 2 stitches. Then I'm going to grab my yarn B the same way that I did before. So I anchor my needle in here, bring yarn B up over yarn A, hold it there, and then knit across. And we can see that it's pulled it away from the edge there. So what it does is it stops any kind of flow being visible on the selvage, but it also stops it being caught on the selvage, because any float that's there not only can be visible, but it can be caught by hands, fingers, well, I don't know, whatever. And you don't want that. You don't want anything tugging on your knitting. Now, if you do the method that's more common with stranded colour work for catching floats, then you might find that this is actually a better place to do it, because it moves it over. Do you remember when in the last demo? I'll show you again. Put yarn B onto your index finger to anchor it and tension it. Insert your needle into the next stitch to knit, but also catch yarn B there. Knit around and drop it off. And I'll just knit one stitch more across. And what it's done, because of the way that you're knitting, the way it's catching it, it moves it over, traps it twice, which is actually probably a better method for catching floats, vertical floats along the selvage. Okay, so that's how you would do that there. And again, like the other one, they're not visible along the edge. You can't see them from the right side of the work, and they're not getting in the way at all of it being worn. Okay, this final swatch, I'm going to show you how to float in two parts, because this motif alternates across. So we need to carry the yarn that way to start the next motif, and then once we've done that motif, we need to bring it back over here. So you're carrying two ways. Let's have a little look. See, that's upside down. Let's put it the right way up. I carried across here, and then I carried across here, catching it every few stitches and ridges. Now, because you're kind of carrying across and diagonally, you're not floating the yarn across. You're only bringing it over to where the motif is going to start in yarn B. You kind of end up doing it diagonally. Now, where and how frequently you catch yarn B is a little bit of a judgment call. It does depend on the motif. But I do recommend catching as frequently again as you can, again, because of that tension issue. You don't want the floats getting in the way of your stretch. This is the motif that I showed you earlier. Okay, there's the floats on the back, looking very, very similar, but it does not affect the stretch of the fabric at all. That's what we want to achieve. Now, we now need to, where's yarn B? Yarn B is here. Okay, so a few stitches in. We want to, over the next couple of, we've got a few short rows to work here. Over those next short rows, we need to bring yarn B over to a position over here. So it's about kind of 6 or 7 stitches across. So I'm going to work the next short row that's going to be on here. And I'm going to catch yarn B in a slightly different place. So let's move this knit over to this point here. Now yarn B is sitting here. Instead of catching it here like I did when I was catching the vertical floats in the first example, I'm going to knit a couple over, 2 more stitches say, and then catch yarn B here. Now there's a short row that needs to be put in here. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 9, 10. There's a short row that's going to be there. So I'm going to work a German short row on that. Stitch there, turn and go back. All the way to the edge selvage. Now, because this particular pattern has got short rows at this point that decrease in length, it means that I can't necessarily catch floats every other ridge. I've got to try and think about where I want to place them in relation to the short rows. See, you can see you've got short rows down here on this section. I've got to catch the floats around the short rows. So instead of leaving it another ridge, I'm probably going to catch yarn B a couple of other stitches over from where it is on the next row, on the next right side row. It will bring it closer to where the short row is going to be worked here. But then when I do the one row that works all the way across that closes off the short rows here, I will be able to catch it one final time and it'll be in the right place for where we want yarn B to be to work the second half of this motif. So this is the one difference really when you are floating kind of diagonally. It's still up. You're not floating across within a row. You're still floating up the rows, but you are trying to reposition yarn B so that it's ready to be in the next position. And that's the big difference, is you don't necessarily have to leave as many ridges between it as I would for other methods. So I've got to work a short row on that stitch. So I'm going to actually catch yarn B here so that it doesn't interfere with the short row. But I've moved it over just a little bit more so that when I come to work across, it will gradually be getting closer to where it needs to be. So I've got to put another small short row in, just checking my pattern there. Yeah, I've got to put one more small short row in. And because the short rows are getting shorter on this side, it means I'm not going to be able to catch yarn B. So let me just work that. And then I'll work the closing row that's going to cover all of the short rows and show you how I catch yarn B and help it get into position for the next motif. So I've got to put a short row on this one here. So the short row is already short of where I would be floating yarn B. So we don't catch it on this one. But the next row is a plain row. And I'll catch it there, and then we should be pretty close to getting it where we need to be for the motif. Now, let's get my needle and we're going to work across. Close off those short rows and move yarn B over a little bit more to get it closer. So we knit that short row. I'm working German short rows. If you're not sure how to do them, check one of my other videos. Yarn B is there, so we don't want to float it there. We don't really want to float it on one of these short rows. So I'm actually now going to float it over and catch it after the last short row worked there. And if you wanted to, you could put another float in here. However, when you are floating yarn B, it doesn't have to be at exactly the point where the next motif is going to start. You can actually be a couple of stitches beforehand and then carry it over when you're ready to start that. And it creates a small float at the beginning here. And that's fine. So where yarn B has ended up, which is here, is not in a bad position for where it will be to start the next motif. That's perfectly okay. You don't really want to carry any extra floats than you need to, but you do want to think about where you're going to position them and make sure that they are carrying you in the direction that you want to go in. I'm not going to knit to the end of the row because this is a slightly big swatch and we'll be here all day. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to show you we're here. We've carried the floats over here, and we know the motif is going to start a couple of stitches after, so that is a perfectly good place to leave yarn B. So I am now going to switch the camera off. I'm going to work the rest of this row, work this motif here, and then show you how we prepare to bring yarn B back to this point and floating it in the other direction. All right, do that in the next swatch. Alrighty, I have now just finished this second motif, or rather it's the second half of this repeat. There's offset little leaves that are part of this motif. This is called Shoals, and it's a stackable motif in my Short-Row Colourwork book, which has got a whole Stitch Dictionary section. So I've just finished it and worked across to the edge. So before I show you how we carried the floats going back the other way, I just want to show you, this is where I carried the float to. Yarn B, carried it, floated it across to that point there, and then I started the motif here. So catching it and floating it to a couple of stitches before where you need it is fine, because you're only going to get a short float there. And that's all it was. It's not a really long float. In fact, that one was probably the longest one there. When I worked the plain row across, I could have maybe caught it a stitch earlier. But either way, that's not bad. And that's not going to catch on anything, and that's not going to interfere with the stretch of the fabric or anything like that. Now, what we need to do, as we did down here, is we need to start bringing the yarn over consecutive ridges so that it's back in position to work the next motif. And as always, or where possible, I should say, you want to catch the floats when you're working a right side row, because it's easier. Because if you're trying to catch them on a wrong side row, you've got to bring both yarns to the back, switch them over, and then take the working yarn back to the front. And that is when it becomes a little bit more noticeable. So I always recommend, wherever possible, to catch your floats on a right side row. So there's less maneuvering of the yarn, less blips. It's not going to notice as much. Now, the next row in this particular motif is a plain knit row. So I'm going to work across to roughly where yarn B was left parking after we finished the motif. Now, I'm not going to work all the way up to it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop 2 stitches before. No, I'm going to stop 3 stitches before, actually, because we want to catch the yarn on this stitch. So then we'll be floating it 2 stitches across. So that way, because there's only kind of like, I don't know, 7 stitches or something between the 2 motifs, 8 maybe. And because there's 3 or 4 ridges between it, if we kind of float it across 2 stitches every time, that will be enough to make sure that it's in the right place. And again, remember, like we did here, it doesn't have to be right where we're going to start the motif. It can actually be a couple of stitches beforehand. So I've stopped 3 stitches before where yarn B was last used. I'm going to catch it here by bringing it up, knitting with yarn A, and exactly the same way as when I was floating that way, I'm just now going to float that way. So we have to stop a little bit earlier. Instead of working a few stitches more, you work a few stitches less. Now I'm just going to knit to the end of this row. I'm not going to continue this entire swatch, because floating the rest of the yarn B all the way across is exactly the same principle. It's the same as floating it in the other direction. You're doing exactly the same thing. You're just catching it a few stitches apart each time. Just get to the end here, and I'll show you so that the knitting's nice and flat and not curled up by these circulars. How that looks when I turn it over. Okay, slips its selvage on the end, as is my way. So yarn B was last used there. We've just caught it 2 stitches across. There's a whole bunch of short rows that needs to be worked on this side here, which we're not going to sit and do because we'll be here for ages. But when I come across next, I'll work to the end, and the next time I have a row on the right side row, which will be down this part of the motif, I will then bring the yarn across slightly more diagonally and catch it 2 or 3 stitches across, and then I'll do the same. And this is how I did it here. All right, we're working exactly the same thing. So it's the same principle, whichever way that you are floating, whichever direction you're going in, whether you're going that way or that way. You maybe do it every right side row and move it across 2 or 3 stitches at a time. This is what I did here, 2 or 3 stitches at a time, but did it kind of on every ridge, every available opportunity, just so I could catch the floats more frequently. I probably put that one a little bit close there, and maybe that one stitch not far over enough. I could have made that shorter, but still, that's not a bad length float. You don't want them any longer than that if you can help it, but that's not bad at all. All right. So that's basically the principle when you are carrying across. You've just got to take it diagonally, move it over a couple of stitches each ridge, catch each row if you can, each right side row if you can, and move it over a couple of stitches. And I say it's a judgment call. All right. So I hope that's helped show you the different ways that you can carry vertical floats in short row colourwork. I am sure there are other colourwork methods where this could be handy. I've used it in some of my sideways mosaic hats, some of my sideways dip stitch hats. I think the common theme there is sideways because you are knitting in that direction, so you need to carry your yarn bee vertically and upwards so that you don't have to cut it and weave in all those ends. Short-Row Colourwork is probably the one where you're going to need to worry, or sorry, not worry, but concern yourself with carrying vertically and slightly diagonally and in each direction, but it's the same each time. Where I would normally say if you're carrying yarn B in a straight line, whether it's either at the selvage edge, which is not quite straight, or with a border where it would be straighter, then you probably catch it every other ridge, which is every 4 rows, 2 rows. 4 rows. Whereas when you are carrying your float slightly diagonally, I would catch it on every right side row, which is every other row, every 2 rows, but move it a couple of stitches across each time. How far does depend on your pattern, on your motif, and you will be able to gauge that. Yeah, you'll get a hang of it. I mean, most sideways knit hats, or most of mine anyway, are constructed of panels. Treat your first panel as a swatch and see if your floats are how you like them. All right. If that's been helpful, please do kind of do the like, follow, subscribe thing. That would be much appreciated. If there are other techniques that relate to short row colourwork that you are interested in learning more about, especially if you've bought the book and you'd like some clarification, please leave me a comment and let me know. If you are using this technique in something in a sideways knit hat that isn't short row colourwork, then I hope it's still helpful because the same principles apply. You are carrying vertical floats so that you do not need to cut yarn B and have extra ends to weave in, because who wants all that extra finishing? We don't. We want to keep it minimum, right? So have fun with your hats and let me know your thoughts below. See ya.